Here are the terms for the age of limited war in the 18th century. And I put limited war in quotes because in some respects it really wasn't so limited. And by the way, the 18th century, I've rendered it here, but military historians often refer to it as the Ancien Regime, which is a reference to the decades before the French Revolution. So the old regime is the force of meaning. The terms you'll find on the PDF, so I won't spend too much time with them, but there are two key ones that I want to point out to your attention: Westphalian International Order and Grand Strategy. You've already had exposure to these, so this is by way of review. Now, by the end of this presentation, you should understand the international order created by the Westphalian settlement. Of course, you've already had some exposure to that, so this is review. The elements of grand strategy, which you've also been exposed to, so this is another review. The cultural image of the age of limited war. The emergence of laws and customs regarding war during the 18th century. This is a significant period in terms of significant developments in international law that were very influential thereafter. The impact of 18th century warfare on civilians, and the definitions of enlistment, sustaining, and combat motivation, and their application to 18th century soldiers. And we're going to be using the army of Louis XIV as our example. So we'll be examining what reasons French soldiers enlisted for, what sustained them over years of military service, and then combat motivation. How did they deal with the tremendous risk of wounds and death in battle? Then we're going to look at the War of the Spanish Succession as an illustration of military conflict during the age of limited war. There were a number of other wars during this period, but we're not going to look at all of them. The War of the Spanish Succession will suffice for us to get an understanding of the sort of the patterns of war during this period. Then the causes, conduct, and consequences of the 7 Years' War, which we're also going to look at. And this is sort of the last of the wars of the Ancien regime. And then finally, the major military reforms that occurred on the eve of the French Revolution. And we're really talking mostly about the major military reforms in the French army. Now, to review the international order created by the Westphalian settlement, we're going to look for selected elements of this. Sovereignty is really important. States had complete control over everything that happened within their borders: revolts, religious alterations, repression of dissidents, anything else. The principle of sovereignty was very, very important. Religion, of course, had ceased to be a motivation for war. And then there was a view of international policy that 20th century scholars would call realism, that became the dominant frame within which European countries operated. The maintenance of a balance of power in Europe became the main driver of armed conflict. And then raison d'etat, literally reason of the state, became the basis on which rulers determined whether and when to go to war, when to make and break alliances, and so forth. Now, by way of reviewing grand strategy refers to the use by a state of all its resources to achieve long-term objectives. It can refer to a grand strategy in a single war or grand strategy over a long period of time. And the basic elements are diplomatic, ideological, military, and economic power. You can remember these sort of conveniently by the acronym DIME, which the Department of Defense developed some years ago, and in professional military education, officers learn, and so By diplomatic power, we mean the ability to befriend or threaten other states, create and dissolve alliances, and settle conflicts by negotiation. By ideological power, we mean the ability to influence um, other countries by way of appealing values, usually aimed at the population of another state rather than other states directly, by which I mean the monarch, his high ranking officials and so on. And then military power, the ability to give diplomats leverage in negotiations through the threat of force, and the ability to achieve the state's goals through violence when wars were declared. And then finally, economic power, the ability to generate wealth, to pay for large armies and navies, to pay for war, and to pay other states to help them fight. Now, why is it called the age of limited war? Well, there are basically six reasons for this. The first one is military conflicts during this period usually involve sort of jostling for relatively small stakes compared to the ideologically driven 30 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars. Cities and regions during this period were often seized as bargaining chips in peace negotiations rather than with the intent of permanent possession. And peace treaties usually involve the return of some or all captured territory. So the objective of most wars during the 18th century, was not to seize territory, which would become common later. It was to achieve other kinds of objectives. And once those objectives were achieved, then these these captured territories and so forth no longer matter, except in a few cases. And then another reason that war was limited during this period was the high cost and relative fragility of armies and navies. That made monarchs cautious about seeking major battles, because in a major battle, even a victory, you were going to lose thousands of soldiers to death and wounds, and you had difficulty getting new soldiers, training them up to speed, and making them combat capable. So now, as a corollary, there was a preference for sieges over pitched battles. And during this period, there was the development of rules of war with an emphasis on restraint. And then finally, we have in the present day the romantic fiction that during this period, this age of limited war, wars were conducted with chivalry. And what I want to do next is show you about a 5-minute excerpt from a film called The Last of the Mohicans that shows the surrender of Fort William Henry, which was a real fort that was in upstate New York, with a Colonel Monroe in charge of the fort, and then Marshal Montcalm of France being in command of the force besieging Fort William Henry. And this actually, I've got this here mostly to show you this kind of romantic view of war during this period, but I also want to give you a sense of what war was like during the 7 Years' War, because that's the war that is depicted here. And what you're going to find here is that this is a piece of the 7 Years' War called the French and Indian War in North America, where the French and the English fought one another, but they and their allies also fought one another in Europe. There was fighting in the 7 Years' War in South America. There was fighting in the 7 Years' War in India. And so this is an example of really the worldwide reach of the 7 Years' War. It can be said to be the first global human conflict. So let's take a look.
Colonel Monroe, I have known you as a gallant antagonist. I am happy to make your acquaintance as a friend.
And I yours, Monsieur le Marquis.
Please accept my compliments for the strong and skillful defense of your fortress. Under the command of a lesser man, it would have fallen long ago, given the superior numbers and materials. Chance has allowed me to array against you.
Monsieur le Marquis, I'm a soldier, not a diplomat. You called us parley for a better reason than an exchange of compliments.
You have already done everything which is necessary for the honor of your prince. But now I beg you to listen to the admonitions of humanity. I beg you to consider my terms for your surrender.
Perhaps the General's glass can reach as far as the Hudson and seize the size and imminence of the army of Webb.
My scouts intercepted this dispatch intended for you. Capitaine de Bougainville.
To Colonel Monroe. Sir, I regret to inform you that I have no men available to send to your rescue. It is quite impossible. I advise you to seek terms for surrender. I remain Jérôme Webb at Fort Edward.
This is the signature of Webb. And I know the temper of our men. Rather than spend the war in a French prison hulk in Hudson Bay, they fight to the end.
You've heard your answer, Monsieur le Marquis.
Sir, I beg you not to sign the death warrant of so many until you have listened to what I have to say. Go on. None of your men will see the inside of a prison barge. They are free, so long as they return to England and fight no more on this continent, and the civilian militia return to their farms.
Their arms?
They may leave the fortress fully armed.
My colors?
Carry them to England with pride.
Allow me to consult with my officers. Lived to see something which I never expected. A British officer afraid to support another.
Webb can burn in hell, and we'll go back and dig our graves behind those ramparts.
Death and honor are thought to be the same. But today I have learned that sometimes they are not.
Sir.
Monsieur le Marquis, I am deeply touched by such unusual and unexpected generosity. My fort is yours, under the condition that I be given till dawn to bury my dead, to prepare my men and women for the long journey ahead, and to hand my wounded over to your surgeons.
Granted, monsieur.
Now, actually, that scene is basically historically accurate. Montcalm and his army did indeed besiege Fort William Henry. The parley between him and Colonel Monroe occurred historically. The French did indeed intercept a letter saying that A British general elsewhere was not going to come to the rescue of Fort William Henry, which was expected. And in terms of surrenders after sieges, that formality, really did occur. So this all suggests that, that this romantic view of this era of limited war as, really, limited. Okay. And then finally, there is this. It's a portion of a poem by Lewis Simpson, who major poet who won the National Book Award, among other honors, and was also a veteran of the Second World War. And I'm just giving you an excerpt of it, but the poem as a whole contrasts this kind of warfare, his conception of limited war in the 18th century, with the bitter and destructive wars of the 20th century. So at Malplaquet and Waterloo, they were polite and proud. They primed their guns with billets doux, and as they fired, bowed. Now, a couple points here. Malplaquet is the bloodiest battle of the era of limited war. It occurred during the War of the Spanish Succession. Waterloo is a bit anachronistic because it belongs to the Napoleonic Wars. And billet doux is it's really pretty funny, because what it says here is they prime their guns with love letters. That's the force of meaning of billet doux. So there we have the cultural meaning of limited war, and it is such a feature of the way that this age of limited war is popularly understood that it merits consideration here. Okay, so